Bueno. Buenos días. Bienvenidos todos a este tercer día de trabajo. Hoy estamos con el primer día del Coloquio Internacional para la Conservación del Patrimonio Cultural Ferrocarrilero. Hoy trabajaremos el tema de conservación para la preservación y nuevos usos culturales del patrimonio ferroviario y sus paisajes culturales. Nos acompaña con una conferencia magistral el señor John Hankey, con un tema de patrimonio cultural ferroviario en Estados Unidos, Orígenes, Estructura y Empleos. John Hankey es director en Historia por la Universidad de Chicago. Trabaja en 3 áreas primarias: planeación, desarrollo organizacional y políticas para organizaciones de fomentos culturales, el desarrollo de presentaciones, contenido, interpretación y colecciones pertenecientes al patrimonio ferrocarrilero, y la planeación, desarrollo y operación de propiedades históricas ferrocarrileras. Actualmente es asesor de la estación B&O en Martinburg y asesor de la Casa Redonda del Condado de Berkeley para la conservación, la reutilización y la adaptación del antiguo complejo comercial del ferrocarril B&O. Consejero del proyecto de investigación que lleva a cabo la Sociedad de National Geographic acerca del túnel de la Avenida Atlántica, asesor de la Sociedad Histórica Nacional Ferrocarrilera y del Programa de Operación de Coches Históricos del Ferrocarril. Trabaja con organizaciones que investigan patrimonio alrededor de los Estados Unidos como un trabajo continuo. Bienvenido, John. Adelante.
Thank you very kindly for an introduction that I really have no idea what you all heard, but I'm delighted to be here. I and my colleagues would like to thank you all very, very much for the opportunity. From our perspective, this conference is already a success. We have made new friends, made new colleagues. Our perspective already is broadened considerably, and I hope that we can return that favor. We in the United States have waited far too long to reach out to our colleagues in other places. I don't think it was of arrogance or ignorance. I'm certain it was simply that we are chasing our tails as everyone else is, and we just simply lost track of the fact. I'd like to begin with an explanation and an apology. I understand the power of words, and I will refer to American when I probably shouldn't. I and all of us in Estados Unidos understand clearly that America extends from Alaska to Argentina. But it is awfully difficult for us to switch gears, and I hope you'll forgive me. It's a deeply ingrained habit. My tongue is not facile enough. My formal training is as a historian, and that's what I bring. My work is profoundly shaped by that perspective. And it compels me to begin by echoing one of Professor Lalana's points from yesterday. People, at any particular time and place, create the railroad as a tool to make their lives better. The essence of history is change through time and connections out to the world in which it is taking place. Times change, people change, needs change, and that means that the railroad will change. And as people's needs change and the railroad changes, as the world turns, we lose track of the past. That is what historic preservation is really all about. And the fact that we must keep human agency always in mind. That's why we have the field of railway heritage, I think, in the first place, to help us remember and recover and preserve at least a part of our past and some sense of why and how things have changed. The railroad can truly be a text that can be read and interrogated and understood in a variety of ways. The text the railway heritage can reveal a great deal about our values at different times, how our daily lives have changed, how we acted in specific ways in the past, and perhaps sometimes why we should be happy that we live today and not in those days before. It is a powerful window into the past. Now, I thought it useful to define a few terms before we move on. In the EU, we understand the very same concepts as those, for example, based on European or UN conventions, but we call things by different names. We understand the term of patrimony a good deal more loosely than perhaps you all do. If you ask, we understand it primarily in terms of who your father was. So if I asked my mother about my patrimony, she would assure me very quickly that yes, she and my father were quite thoroughly married by the time I came along. If you ask scholars, colleagues, folks who should know better what cultural patrimony or historical patrimony is, they will understand broad concepts like mobility or freedom or liberty or independence. We don't use patrimony for things or places. We prefer the term heritage, and we probably misuse that term or use it far too often. Our term for patrimony would be, one term would be National Historic Landmark. We have a program of landmarking properties that we feel have national significance and that are in some way very special. They go through a process of nomination, examination, assessment, and then designation. I think Nathaniel Guest will have much more to say about that tomorrow morning. To us, a monument is primarily anything or place or physical feature that is associated with a commemorative function, a memory of someone or something. Think perhaps of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. We like to name bridges as monuments, for example. There are thousands of bridges in the United States, many of them railroad bridges, that are, in our minds, monuments. Now, in the EU and Canada, we also use the words railway and railroad interchangeably. There's no difference, and I will flip back and forth. We use the terms resource, artifact, and heritage almost interchangeably, and they stand for anything which is old or noteworthy or has some cultural or historic association. And they can be tangible or intangible. We make no distinction between an intangible resource and a tangible resource. A series of hand signals that might convey a certain meaning at a certain point in time would be considered a resource or a heritage asset. We understand preservation to be the act of keeping something intact, protecting it, generally keeping it safe from harm. Preservation to us can be intentional, unintentional, accidental, consequential. It almost doesn't matter. Preservation is the first step in our view of historic preservation or cultural resource management in a series of steps that might lead ultimately to a museum exhibit or long-term conservation. Now, conservation is that next step. To us, it means cleaning, preparing, protecting at a higher level with the idea that we want to stop the clock. Something that is conserved is in a pretty good spot, and we can expect it to last for a very long time. At any point, we may elect to put an artifact, heritage resource, either into ethical adaptive reuse or into a museum exhibit or make it available in some way. Typically, that includes a certain level of interpretation, which to us signifies a context and a real effort to explain it to folks. It's one of those concepts that is very easy to describe and very difficult to do. We have far too many museums that have labels that say, locomotive built 1942, weighs 463,000 pounds, tractive effort 73,000 pounds, and no one in the world knows what that means. But that is not interpretation. That is what we're trying to get past. Now, I'd like you to bear with me for just a moment. I'm going to try something. This may or may not work, but we will see. That could mean two things. It could mean that the old gringo has gone mucho loco, or I could have just conveyed something to somebody. The correct interpretation would be that I just used a 50-year-old hand signal, a railroad hand signal from the Viennese Railroad, to convey a great deal of information to a man on a caboose of a passing freight train. I used a very old, specific, time-specific, place-specific, context-specific set of industrial sign language that told the conductor on the caboose of a passing freight train that he had a problem and needed to stop that train and take very specific action, which is something the conductor can do from the rear end. I told him that he needed to put on the brakes, but that he didn't need to put them on in emergency, which is a fairly dangerous operation. I told him that he had a problem at the front of the train, and that problem was a hot journal bearing, and that because it was not in a critical situation, he could in fact slow the train and stop it in a controlled manner. The fact that I held my hands out like this was the signal to the man on the caboose that I need to tell you something. I'm going to give you a signal, but you need to acknowledge that you see me. Then by giving him the stop signal slowly, I was telling him that you need to stop, and you need to stop right now, but you don't need to put it into emergency. Then by patting my head, I told him that the problem was at the head end of the train. If I had patted my stomach, he would have known that the problem was in the middle of the train, and I will let you all imagine how I would have told him that the problem was at the hind end of the train. Holding my nose told him that it was a hot box, that the journal was hot and was going to begin flaming and burning soon, but because I had given him a slow stop, he knew it was not on fire, and that he had the luxury of a slow stop. Now, if I had rubbed my hands together, that would have meant a sticking brake or a sliding wheel. And there are other gestures that I could have used. That's a great deal of nuanced information to convey to somebody, from someone on the ground to someone on a caboose going by at 50 or 60 kilometers per hour. They would have known immediately what I was telling them, and they would have waved at me, yes, I understand, and I would have waved back up and down, I understand you, I acknowledge you have understood my signal. If I did that to a crew on a modern day CSX freight train, they would probably call the railroad police and have me hauled off. They would have had no idea what I was conveying. They do not know that language any longer. I was taught that as a young railroader 40 years ago by men who learned it probably 40 years before that, and it was part of a rich industrial culture. Now that was an artifact, an ephemeral artifact, an intangible artifact And there are probably now, I don't know, 200 or 300 people in the world who know that language. And that language is different on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it was different on the Union Pacific. It was different on every different railroad. That's an example of how times have changed, and even our understandings of heritage and our definitions of cultural resource management and all those other things have changed. How do we capture that kind of gesture, that kind of artifact, that kind of language? I realize this all may seem complicated and vague, and doubly so because English is a difficult and complex language. But please understand that we in the United States ourselves are still trying to learn English and use it effectively. Trying to get railway heritage in the United States to understand the subtlety of a gesture like that, or the fact that we need to record those gestures and understand them, is a challenge. That's the challenge we face today. I'd like to spin back a bit and suggest that railway heritage in the United States evolved in a very specific way, in very specific places, for very specific reasons, and those reasons were different from the circumstances in, for example, Mexico. I don't know if you all have on your railroads the same kind of sign language. I suspect they exist in a similar fashion all over the world. That gives us a comparative frame to look at things, but how do we begin capturing that? In the United States, to survive and grow, we had to find a way to move ourselves over land quickly and efficiently and effectively. We needed a transportation system which was adaptable, dynamic, democratic, affordable, practical, efficient, all those things. And the railroad gave that to us. It was the one technology that seemed to be effective and that gave us what I call railroad mobility, which itself unfolded differently in different places at different times. At their peak, in the late 19th, early 20th century, railroads carried almost all of our freight, almost all of our passengers between cities, most of our mail and express. It was a remarkable network by any measure. It was almost universal. It literally formed the basis of our economy, our culture in many ways, our political development, and the emergence of what I characterize as modern life. And it happened very quickly. We had, let's take the close of the War of 1812 as a beginning point, which in terms of Mexican culture, for example, is not very long ago. We were a large but not yet continental nation. Let me see if I can show you a picture of that. In the big scheme of things, we were still regarded in Europe as a small, upstart, minor frontier nation. We had no science, few factories, a very little technology. We were largely dependent on Europe for our art, our commercial goods, our high culture, our modes of taste. The quality of life for the average American at the end of the War of 1812 was grim. On the whole, our diet was miserable and based on corn and pork and whatever else we could catch in the woods or bring out of the ocean. Medicine was crude, disease was rampant. We were hot in summer, cold in winter, toiled at monotonous hard work, and we faced a wide variety of peril around every turn. In general, And by many specific measures, the quality of life in the United States in 1800, 1814, that period, was inferior to that of the average Roman in the Mediterranean basin in the year zero. Their quality of life, their health, their food, their general environment was superior to ours. In most ways, the Native Americans in the United States in 1800 had a superior quality of life than the Anglo-European immigrants. Now, 1900, just 8 decades, 9 decades later, one long lifetime, almost everything had changed. The railroad network was over 200,000 miles and constructed to just about its fullest extent. We were a major world power. We had a couple of, with our own civil war and a couple of near social revolutions, we had achieved a pretty stable and pretty progressive political system. We were a transcontinental nation with intense industrialization, intense urbanization, intense agricultural development. We had a vast economy larger than Europe's, or larger than Germany's, England's, and France's combined at the very least. We had our own high fine arts. We had a popular culture. We had a booming educational system, expansive science and technology. We had electricity, automobiles, central heat, indoor plumbing. We had warm houses, cheap clothing, streetcars. The middle class was growing. Not all of these things were available to everyone, but most of them were available to most people to one degree or another. Our quality of life had increased dramatically. Our medical arts were vastly better. We had better food, more of it. We lived longer. Our infant mortality was lower. The life of the United States in 1900 would be familiar and comfortable to most people from the 21st century. I cannot think of another case in human history where so many people from so many different places settled so vast a territory in so short a time and changed their quality of life so vastly. It is an unprecedented change through time, and we as historians have not done a good job of fully understanding it ourselves. We're still trying to grasp how quickly everything evolved and the sources of energy behind it. The railroad was not primarily responsible for all of those changes, but it was essential to all of them. It was a necessary, not a sufficient, but a necessary condition. I cannot imagine a scenario in which the United States, and we could say Canada, and we could say parts of Mexico, I cannot imagine a scenario in which they developed so rapidly and in those directions without that railroad mobility. It was central to all of them. It was a classic progress narrative. That's a way of approaching history in which things get better through time. It epitomizes modernization theory. Again, a complex theory that posits that things get better, things get modern, things move in more or less one direction. It's a kind of a teleological approach. With some justification, Americans came to understand in the 19th century that they were on a path that was heading in one direction, towards a better life, towards better things. To the point that by the middle of the 19th century, railroads had become a kind of secular religion in the United States. People believed in railroads as a solution to problems they didn't even know they had yet. And generally they were correct. Now, I do not offer this account uncritically or as a celebratory approach. the introduction of so powerful and so disruptive a technology in such a raw and unsettled environment as the United States in the 19th century, giving that kind of power to people who had not yet even figured out really who they were or what kind of government they wanted or what kind of nation they were creating, led to many unfortunate consequences. The railroad was like a giant universal can opener. It allowed Americans at will, pretty much, to access every corner of the continent and take what they wanted with little understanding or little heed for the damage they were doing. So the railroad led to a series of, think of deforestation, abusive mineral extraction, the U.S. policy after the Civil War of the extermination of the Plains Indians tribes, a whole program of selfish development that really cared little for the folks coming after. Before the war, the railroad, the plantation system in the South, political interests in the South, were delighted that the railroad would help facilitate the westward expansion of human chattel slavery. So the railroad is not a good thing universally. The railroad is value neutral and totally dependent upon how we use it for what its outcomes are. Oh, that's interesting. I'm missing a page. Alrighty. The point is that by 1900, we were a very different country with a very different outlook, and every point on that continent had essentially been opened by rail. Oh, thank you. Yes, this is the missing page. There is a consequence to that kind of rapid development, and the fact that I'm going to suggest that people essentially internalized the idea that the railroad was, if not their salvation, at least the technology that allowed their lives to get better. From the beginning of the railroad industry in the United States in, let's say, 1825 to 1830, the railroads themselves created monuments to themselves. This is a bridge completed in 1835 by the B&O Railroad, and it is over a river outside Baltimore. It is modeled directly after an older stone arch bridge in Great Britain, and it is named the Thomas Viaduct in honor of the first president of that railroad. And you may be able to see on the right-hand side, top of the bridge, an Egyptian obelisk. That's a monument to the directors and first officers of the B&O Railroad. So this company is erecting monuments in an Egyptian style at the end of a monumental named bridge to its own officers 8 years after the company is founded. We've always liked monuments like this in the U.S. We're very, very fond of them. The first history book on railroads is 1853. Again, this particular railroad, the Baltimore, Ohio, called The History and Description of the B&O Railroad, and it looks very much like railfan books that you can still buy today. The first instance of locomotive preservation in the United States seems to be 1866, when a locomotive called the John Bull was set aside for preservation by the Camden and Amboy Railroad. That locomotive was a British import, 1831. It was heavily modified for use in the United States. But what is significant is that when it was retired from service, they didn't break it up for scrap. They shoved it into a barn and preserved it, not knowing what might happen to it. A few years later, that railroad was purchased by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Pennsylvania Railroad then sold this locomotive to the Smithsonian Institution for exhibit as a museum object. It's significant that the first major purchase by our U.S. National Museum in 1872 or 3 was a locomotive. The Pennsylvania Railroad exhibited this locomotive at our U.S. National Centennial in Philadelphia in 1876, and other railroads also throughout the 1870s and 80s began the practice of exhibiting their oldest locomotives next to their newest locomotives. A clear, simple, direct progress narrative that rather unambiguously showed people that that was bad, this is good, that was then, this is now, that was old, this is new, slow, fast, crude, better. It was a powerful trope. Many countries at this point had long and very sophisticated traditions of history, historic preservation, of cultural conservation of various sorts. Great Britain, for example, Italy, France, Germany. We had no traditions of that sort whatsoever in the United States in the 19th century. It wasn't until 1852 or 3 that a group of ladies in Virginia finally got around to organizing a society to preserve George Washington's home, Mount Vernon, when Mount Vernon was about to be sold to be redeveloped before the Civil War. This is all happening in a kind of sui generis environment. History, as it was practiced in the United States, had to be practical, it had to be useful. It was almost always based on politics. We regarded history as merely a way to celebrate our independence. The 4th of July was our national secular holiday. And our history was not analytical, it was not comparative, it was not what the Europeans certainly recognized as history. That began to change somewhat as we approached the 400th anniversary of the alleged discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. The fair, even though it was held a year late, was intended to show American progress in the 19th century and be a model of a new life. It was an immense fairgrounds, over 1,000 acres altogether, dozens of major buildings, all created in a neoclassical style. The transportation building was one of the largest and most elaborate, and inside were exhibits from all major railroads, the major locomotive and car builders, and other folks. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central railroads each erected pavilions of their own at the fair. Think of these as railroads attempting to get control of their history in some way that was practical and accessible and useful. These pavilions had little exhibit buildings and then tracks where the railroads could display old equipment and new equipment and interpret things in a straightforward then and now fashion. The Pennsylvania borrowed back that John Bull locomotive from the Smithsonian Institution, and in May of 1893 operated that old engine from Philadelphia all the way to Chicago, over 700 miles, under its own steam. Every day during the fair, the Pennsylvania Railroad gave people short rides around the fairgrounds behind the John Bull. And then at the end of the fair, it steamed the engine all the way back to Washington and gave it back to the Smithsonian. Imagine today convincing a museum director that you'd like to borrow one of their largest and most precious objects and then use it out on the railroad in all sorts of weather, in all sorts of hazards for 1,700 miles. I promise I'll give it to you back better than I better than I got it. I suggest that I say that to suggest that we didn't really know what a museum was in the United States. We didn't know what artifacts really were. We had no curatorial ethos, really. We had no sense of what we were doing. Now, what is mostly significant about this fair is that the largest exhibit, covering almost 10 acres in the transportation building, was by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It assembled something it called the World's Railway. It included 4 tracks holding 54 locomotives in a sequential order. Some of those locomotives were the B&Os, some were borrowed from other railroads, some were replicas made out of wood, but they described essentially the entire history of the railway throughout the world, and for good measure they included some ancient ox carts and some wagons and things from other places. The sheer numbers involved in this exhibit were impressive. They had over 1,700 images of various sorts, photographs, paintings, drawings. This was not just an exhibit of B&O history, but an exhibit of the entire history of land transportation through the past 5,000 or 6,000 years. It cost the railroad about $125,000, which in today's money would be about 25 million US dollars. 27 million people attended the fair, and we can surmise that a goodly number of them saw this exhibit. It was more so than any previous attempt. It was contextual. It almost approached the level of good history. It was trying to show the relationship of land transportation to other forms and human evolution. And we still have to ask why. Why would a company that was in dire financial straits and heading for bankruptcy spend $125,000 to create such an elaborate exhibit? It certainly wasn't that the outlay was going to help increase the passenger business, or they were not an altruistic organization. The answer, I think, represents an early attempt at what we now know as corporate reputation management. The railroad industry in the 1880s and 90s was held in very low regard. And this may be surprising to some folks, because at the same time I'm suggesting that Americans in the 19th century understood the railroad as the agent that brought them a modern way of life and prosperity. Most Americans in those years cordially detested the railroads as a whole. That is because railroading was America's first big business, and it at that point was the largest industrial sector on the continent. Only agriculture employed more people. Now, at that time, American business itself was a laissez-faire blood sport. This is the robber baron era. Railroads generally played rough, both with themselves and with the public. They routinely engaged in practices. Now, this is routinely engaged in things like fraud, embezzlement, stock watering, rate discrimination, rebates, abuse of past privileges, blatant bribery and political corruption, and very harsh treatment of its workers. It was not a lot of fun to work for a railroad in the late 19th century. All these things slowly turned public opinion against the railroad industry, and the people at different levels and in different ways responded. There was a backlash. Shippers created shippers' bureaus and shippers' leagues. Farmers created grange organizations. Newspapers began referring to the railroad problem. Railroads were no longer the solution. Railroads had become the problem. And this began to get their attention. In 1887, Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission to begin regulating the railroads, to bring them to heel. In 1893, passed the Railway Safety Appliance Act, mandating the use of certain equipment such as automatic couplers and air brakes. The industry began to understand that it had a problem, and it wasn't so much a public relations problem, but a political problem. The railroads came to understand in the 1890s that Congress could indeed come down with a fairly heavy hand, and the exhibit at the World's Columbian Exposition was, in fact, the opening act or the opening shot in a sustained campaign to represent the railroad industry in a more friendly light. They're trying to reassert the idea that railroads are not the problem. They, in fact, have been the solution and will continue to be. This was very, very sophisticated, modern corporate behavior, and it was entirely within the realm of reason. There had, for example, been toy trains since the beginning of railroads themselves. People liked riding trains. They liked taking special excursions. People still had a personal relationship with railroading. So the Columbian Exposition represents a turning point. It's the first time I think we see the emergence, the seeds of what would become the field of railway heritage, railway preservation, railway museums. The exhibit was a success, and there was a move in the newspapers and trade press to create a permanent U.S. railroad museum. The idea was that the good work that the Columbian Exposition, and especially the B&O exhibit, had done could be continued and help repair the relations between the public and the industry. That didn't quite happen. At the close of the fair, the majority of the railway exhibits were instead moved into a department of the newly created Columbian Exposition. The interests in Chicago rebuilt the Palace of Fine Arts building at the fairgrounds, and it was in rough competition with the Smithsonian. It was a museum of everything. Very nicely done, but it did preserve at least the railway exhibits. The first standalone railway museums we see are in Norway in 1897 and in Germany, Nuremberg, in 1899. The railway department of this field museum occupied 15 substantial halls and spaces. It was more compact than the large exhibit at the World's Fair, but it basically presented everything in chronological order. It was an extensive, sizable, comprehensive presentation of railway heritage, and in my opinion deserves to be regarded as the first railway museum. It clearly was intended to be a permanent installation, and unfortunately it was not. After just 10 years, the railway department at the Columbian Museum closed. The museum decided it wanted to concentrate on natural history instead, and most of the donors got their exhibits back, which meant the B&O Railroad got its locomotives and cars back, and almost immediately took them to St. Louis and reinstalled them as part of the St. Louis World's Fair, which ran in 1904. The next significant development in railway heritage is in 1913 at the semi-centennial of the West Virginia statehood. West Virginia, one of our states, was separated from the state of Virginia in 1863 as a consequence of and in the middle of our Civil War. So 1913 was their 50th anniversary as a state. Wheeling in West Virginia on the Ohio River, the far west side of the state, had been the original terminus of the B&O. And in June, the city of Wheeling held a week-long celebration of statehood. Saturday, June 15th was, or June 21st, I'm sorry, was railroad days to commemorate the role railroads had had in the creation of West Virginia and its growth. The B&O brought a half dozen of its relic locomotives, a term they liked to use, and ran them under their own steam in a kind of parade several times a day. So far as I can tell, this is the first time any railroad, any museum, any fair operated in sequence a series of locomotives running under their own steam to demonstrate to people how they might have looked and smelled and to provide a higher level of interaction. The problem was, in 1893, when the B&O created the exhibit in Chicago, it had discarded the tenders. So imagine, if you can, half a dozen old locomotives coming by without their tenders behind. They must have looked very silly, and it must have been very interesting to operate them. But this was a significant elaboration, and it's coming at a time when the popular culture is changing, and railroads are perceived to be under control for the first time. Another significant milestone. You might not think that a cheap pulp magazine published in New York for railway employees would be quite such an important milestone, but it was. Railroad Man's Magazine in 1906 coincided with all sorts of things, but it represents the first time a railroad publication is available to the public. That is, it has stories, it has reminiscences, it has ads, it has fiction. It's a pretty lively thing, and it very quickly turns into our first railfan publication, something that non-railroaders would enjoy reading. Now, railway heritage and railway history at this time were not yet separate from each other or distinct from other fields. There really was very little historic literature in railroading. Toys also were beginning to become more important as a kind of cultural marker. Toys had been around since the beginning, but one of the milestones is the creation of the Lionel Company, Lionel Trains, in 1900, the emergence of electric trains, which were much more reliable. They became mass-produced consumer goods, much less expensive, and the idea of creating train gardens gave them much more appeal to adults and children alike. What it begins to look like in this period is that the railroad industry's efforts to soften its reputation, to reconnect with the people, to exert a kind of cultural influence is beginning to work, and that people are beginning to respond much more favorably. The World War I created a series of disruptions and dislocations that interrupted that process. The railroads themselves performed quite poorly during the war. And after the war, especially, competition from automobiles, trucks, and buses were pressed very hard on the railroads. What that meant was that it was even more critical for the railroad industry to reach out, be friendly, find its audiences wherever it could. And it is a cliche to suggest that the interwar period, from the end of World War I to the beginning of the Second World War, was a busy, complex, fraught time, many social, cultural, technological innovation. But it's also true. And in that period is where we find the origins of American railway heritage beginning to flourish and grow and become identifiably a kind of cultural field. I'd like to suggest that there are 6 factors or 6 reasons for that in that very busy 20-year period. First, model railroading grew in popularity. This was an elaboration of toy trains. This was an adult hobby where mostly men, again this is an incredibly gendered topic, would create scale models of great fidelity of railroad locomotives and cars that they chose to. The hobby grew rapidly throughout the 1920s. In New York in 1926, the New York Society of Model Engineers is formed, which is the first model railroad club we have. In 1934, a number of modelers formed the National Model Railway Association. Model Railroader magazine begins publication in 1934. Now, second, we see the emergence of railfan organizations, railroad enthusiast clubs. Folks in the U.S. had always been, had a passion for creating voluntary associations and joining together for various things. In 1921, we have the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society. 1934, the National Railway Historical Society, and also a group called Railroad Enthusiasts, Inc. One important development in 1941 was the publication of a magazine called Trains, which is still very much with us. What this represents is the development of specific communities of folks who are joining together and self-identifying and saying, I like trains. The railroad industry on its own recognizes that, and through these 2 decades goes to great lengths to recognize people's increasing association in almost the way that sports teams attract loyalty. One of the odd things of the 20s is that it was the centennial of the railroad industry in the United States. So in the East, we have 6 different railroads, the 6 primary railroads in our East, all claiming to be the first, or the earliest, or the one with the most history. We have these giant corporations who are competing with one another, like cats in a bag, all asserting their priority. And it's not just a matter of attracting passengers or generating publicity. I think they sincerely believed this was important. One of the railroads, again the B&O, in 1927, goes so far as to hold it's almost its own World's Fair. It creates a large fairgrounds west of Baltimore, and over the course of a month and a half in fall of 1927, has 4 exhibit buildings, and the fairgrounds are open all day. There's no charge. They are telling the story of American railroading through the perspective of the B&O. They, twice a day, had a parade of historic equipment around a large oval track with a giant grandstand. They clearly had a celebratory agenda. This is not good history, but it's entertaining history. And it kind of presages a lot of railroad fairs and railroad exhibits that will come in the following 20 years. Now, a fourth opportunity in this interwar period was advances in still and motion picture photography. And it may seem odd to suggest that as related to railway heritage, but think of how important photography is to railroad enthusiasts and railroad preservation in general. The perfection and development of much better cameras that were cheaper and easier to use and made decent photographs in the 1920s opens up a range of possibilities, much like our cell phones did in the 1990s and even more recently. It's risky to assert that better photography somehow changes the way railroads do their outreach and have activities, but I think it's reasonable to suggest that the ability to make decent photographs kind of works hand in hand. It adds value to the entire effort of things like excursions and rail fairs and engaging the public. Through this period also, the quality of the academic and the popular railroad literature grows immensely. There are many more books. The books are better. The history is better. I think partly that's because scholars are beginning to understand that it's okay to like trains and write about them will not be a penalty for being a kind of rail fan. Finally, in 1933, and this is immensely important, and we don't really have a handle on it yet, but the National Park Service created the Historic American Buildings Survey as part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal Make Work programs. We had tens of thousands of architects, draftsmen, photographers, historians out of work, and the Historic American Building Survey was a systematic attempt to do two things. The first was to put some of these people back to work and help jumpstart the economy, and the second was to begin a serious effort throughout the country, a systematic effort to document, record, list, inventory buildings that at least had some historic or architectural or cultural merit. This was the first time we as a country had ever undertaken that kind of systematic cultural assessment. And even though railroads were not directly or explicitly part of that effort, it had immensely powerful consequences for this emerging field of railway heritage and railway enthusiasm. It provided the first framework we had for understanding and cataloging and categorizing historic structures. Now, by this time, railway heritage had at least constructed a kind of ideology, a kind of identity. There were people who called themselves railroad enthusiasts. If someone had done that before the First World War, no one would have known what that meant. By the beginning of the Second World War, I think it's fair to say that the railroads had done a very good job in educating the American people and creating a class of folks who identified themselves as part of the railway project, even though they did not work for the railroad. Now, this is obviously unfolding in the boom years of the 1920s and the crash years of the 1930s. And World War II interrupts everything. World War II changes everything. It literally took almost a decade out of so many people's lives in so many ways. After the war, it's hard for me to describe in shorthand just how different the United States was, just how different, how much had changed for almost everyone in every aspect of their lives. And it took a few years after the war for life to begin to return to normal. Now, the general trajectory of railway heritage in the US, and this was true also of Europe, obviously, changes dramatically after that war. I'm going to have to resort to gross oversimplifications and generalizations, but the period from roughly 1950 to the present has been one of those astonishing periods of change and development that come along only rarely. I'm going to suggest there are three periods in that post-war era that, taken together, accurately describe the way our railway heritage has developed and changed. They overlap, and I call the first period from roughly 1950 to 1980 the salvage era. The second is roughly from 1970 through 1995, and I call that the Great Reorganization. And the third, from about 1990 to the present, is the era of professionalism. Now, the salvage era refers to the fact that during those first three decades, from roughly 1950 to about 1980, the primary focus of almost every railway heritage activity was preservation, some aspect of physically acquiring or documenting or otherwise recording a cultural resource, because by that time we understood railroading as a cultural resource that was changing rapidly, and there were several proximate causes for those changes. First is that after the war, it became clear that U.S. railroads were planning on retiring their entire steam locomotive fleet. For the railroad industry had been working at that point for 50 years to educate people that steam trains were good and that steam engines were a symbol of American progress and that they epitomized American power and life and all of that. And now they're saying, well, you know, in 5 years we're not going to have any more steam engines. And you better get used to it because we're beginning to replace them with diesel locomotives. And that came as quite a shock to many people. The railroads had romanticized steam engines, essentially fetishized them, and now they were going to take them away. A second cause, and it's related in many ways to the first, is that that meant that the railroad industry was going to knock down tens of thousands of buildings, roundhouses, coaling towers, water stations, the locomotive terminals that Professor Lalana was talking about yesterday. These were all going to go away. And a third had to do with a dramatic drop in railroad traffic after the war. After the war, federal, state, and local governments began an extensive program of road construction. They built airports and air traffic control systems. They improved ports and inland waterways. And all of those things, all of those modes of transportation competed directly with the railroads. So the railroad business, the railroad traffic went into a decline that accelerated through the 1950s and 60s. What that meant was that literally the traditional railroad landscape was beginning to disappear before Americans' eyes. And unlike Great Britain or other places that had some national or had some cultural framework for recording a landscape like that, we had none. Americans believe passionately in the free market system, except when they don't. But railroads were very much off limits to any kind of meddling by outside influences. Even though they were regulated by the federal government, there was absolutely no hope that anyone could help them understand that they needed to at least do what we today call mitigation as these things went away. As a result, hundreds, perhaps thousands of locomotives and cars that today we would easily be able to list either as monuments or as historic resources worthy of preservation or at least of documentation, simply got cut up for scrap. They just went away. Thousands of buildings that might today have been adaptively reused or preserved or maintained as monuments of some sort were simply knocked down and taken to landfills, sometimes in the middle of the night, to prevent local opposition from getting a court order. It was the wholesale removal of a huge aspect of American life, and there's a flip side to it, and that's why I call it the salvage era. That accelerating loss of fabric galvanized many Americans. It resulted in the creation of groups and preservation societies and individual efforts to try and save something. At a local level, people did what they could based on the resources they had at the moment. There was no coordination, no policy, no hint of any kind of overall strategy. This was a kind of grassroots up from the bottom movement. To paraphrase an American pop song, the one organizing principle of this 30-year period of preservation was get it while you can. The idea was that if you miss the chance to preserve something, there will be no second chance. The American steel industry was booming at that time, and every piece of railroad equipment that wasn't immediately saved in some way was made into a shiny new Chevrolet somewhere. Now, at the corporate level, some companies did make attempts to recognize or preserve their heritage. The B&O Railroad maintained its historical collection, and in fact in 1953 created a museum to house it. Certain railroads like the Union Pacific or the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy or the Southern Railway maintained a fleet of steam locomotives just as demonstration pieces. Most of the activity, though, took place under the auspices of thousands of small clubs and individual groups. Keep in mind that the United States at this point is a very big country, 150 million people, approaching 200 million, and that there was an awful lot of railway heritage to save and an awful lot of people interested in doing it. Our tax structure favors the creation of small, independent, not-for-profit organizations, and many of them started with the goal of saving 1 or 2 or 3 pieces. One example is the Illinois Railway Museum, which was formed in the late 40s, early 50s to preserve a couple of streetcars in the Midwest. They now have over 300 pieces of equipment and represent the largest railroad museum in the country. There were perhaps a dozen museums, and I'll point out that we don't know for sure because no one has really ever counted them, and Nathaniel is going to talk more about that tomorrow also. But roughly a dozen of these small museums grew into fairly sizable institutions, holding anywhere between 10, 15, up to 100 pieces of equipment. Again, keep in mind, this is the get it while you can era. And these places knew that if they didn't get these things to a safe place behind a fence, they would be gone forever. At least if they're behind a fence, they're going to rot slowly in place, but there will be options preserved. There are probably, as a result of this period, I'm going to say 300 small railroad museums in the United States. That's only an average of 6 per state. Some states like Pennsylvania and Ohio have dozens of these little museums. They run on very small budgets. They have volunteer staffs. There are also many, perhaps hundreds, of substantial railway heritage exhibits at other museums. These are regional historical societies or museums that, for one reason or another, either as a sizable exhibit or as a department within their organizational structure, have a substantial amount of railway heritage. We have no idea, really, who they are. It's all by anecdote and by stumbling upon them, and we've never undertaken a survey to figure out just what is out there. Now, through the salvage era, and I'm speaking now as a museum professional, a responsible person, and someone who has never been arrested. Let's just say that in terms of conventional museum practice, some of our activities in this period were fluid and dynamic and would not represent current best practices for cultural resource management. Sometimes that meant a phone call from a railroad official saying, "Get down here with the truck right now. You have 4 hours to carry off anything you can load, and after that it all goes away." Sometimes that meant a key appearing in somebody's hands, and that key was to a station, and that station was going to be demolished the next day. And if you could get into the station with that key before the contractor got there in the morning, well, station came down, and who knows what was in there. I remember a case in the early 1980s where a railroad official in a large Midwestern city came under great pressure to get rid of, I think it was 4 freight cars and 3 passenger cars clogging up the terminal. They were old and outdated and no longer useful to the company. And this particular railroad official, rather than shoving them into the scrap yard that he was instructed to shove them into for disposal, called a crew, got an engine, had those cars delivered to the local heritage railway 30 miles away in the middle of the night. This little railroad didn't know they were coming. The next morning, there are these cars sitting on their interchange track. No note, no explanation. They figured out what was going on. The corporate bosses on the railroad were happy. The cars had gone away. They didn't know where. It was rather informal, shall we say. I remember just vividly one instance in Baltimore. I was involved in a heritage preservation group in the early 1970s that had a fleet of passenger cars, old, nicely preserved B&O passenger cars, and the railroad, the B&O Railroad, was closing its car shop, its passenger car repair facility in Baltimore. And the company policy at that point was when a facility closed, everything inside was automatically obsolete and was loaded into freight cars and carried to the company landfill and covered with at least 2 feet of dirt. And that was to prevent theft and all sorts of things. And the local general car foreman, who was a kind of a brusque, hard fellow, we never really thought he liked us, apparently sent a carman, a car inspector, to look at our cars without telling us, and he found a defect. Something was wrong with one of our cars, the trucks, the wheel assembly. And he directed that that car be placed in the car repair shop for repair. And it was going to be the last car repaired in that building before the men were furloughed and everything went away. And so the car goes into the shop, and then we hear through a low-level car department employee that, you know, the railroad doesn't weigh cars. It doesn't put them over a scale when they go into a shop like this. He said, the car's going to be in there for a week. And, you know, we think you guys ought to be watching, inspecting the work being done on the car. And the last thing he said was, you know, the railroad doesn't weigh cars when they come out of the shop. We understood. The car went in, got fixed, and it came out weighing approximately 4 tons more than it did when it went in. We used those parts for years. And the stuff that went to the landfill, at least we'd had a chance. That sort of stuff happened all the time, everywhere, for 30 years. And the reason I think we have a fighting chance at keeping so much of our equipment operating and intact and restorable is because so many people, for so many years, were unindicted thieves. And it's probably best that we do not talk more about that. There are garages and storage buildings throughout the United States that have yet to be opened, like little time capsules. Now that, of course, leads to the Great Reorganization. A 30-year period of stress and opportunity acquisition and get it while you can is going to create a hangover. It's going to create too many small museums, too many duplicates being saved, too much material that needs to be rationalized. And that has happened, continues to happen, but that happened in earnest beginning in the 1960s and 70s and extending through the 90s. It occurred in a few phases. One was the almost complete separation of the railroad industry from its own heritage. This was unprecedented in the same way that no other American industry so completely embraced its heritage and spent so much money and so many years teaching people how to be rail fans. I have had very experienced and very wise senior corporate folks in other industries take me aside and say, what are your companies doing? They have spent 100 years building up a connection with a public, establishing all sorts of goodwill and stock in trade, and now they're running you folks off and shutting the door. And they're saying, you know, in our industry, we would love to have the kind of of connections and deep goodwill that you do, what are these guys thinking? And we have to say, we don't know what they are thinking. And it is astonishing that the railroad industry just kind of shooed us out the door. And I also could call this the Great Divorce, because that's what it felt like. In this period, we also see the emergence of specific fields such as historic preservation or cultural resource management, railroad history. These are established as legitimate disciplines which offer degree programs at respected universities. There is, for the first time, a career path. There are professional organizations and professional standards being put in place, so that it is now possible in this period for someone, a young person, to imagine a career in railway heritage that has a professional trajectory. One of the most important things happening in this period is the creation of, at all levels, a body of law and practice that begins to guide all the work that all of these little and big museums are starting to do. Most influential for us was the passage in 1966 of the National Historic Preservation Act. It was part of what we know as the Great Society in the 1960s, a sustained federal policy initiative that included things like our Voting Rights Act, many civil rights laws, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Water Act, the creation of a federal level Department of Transportation. There are so many things happening in this intensely activist period to bring the United States at least a little further into the mid-20th century as compared with Europe, for example. Now, what this does is this gives us a structure of laws and practice and expectations, and most importantly, it gives us something called Section 106, which we in Railway Heritage in the United States wield like a big club. Section 106 basically means that any project that involves federal money has to follow a basic minimum of environmental investigation, of archaeological investigation, and if any resource is found to be historic or eligible for our National Register of Historic Places, it has to be documented before the bulldozers can take it away. Now, in this period of transition, many of our railroad heritage institutions began their own transitions from volunteer staff to paid staff, or from informal governance to formal governance, or from let's put on a play, boys and girls, to let's think seriously about what our goals are. Let's do some planning. Let's become legitimate cultural heritage institutions. One of the most astonishing transitions here is the direct involvement of government at all levels in railway heritage preservation. We have the creation of the California State Railroad Museum, the Nevada State Railroad Museum, Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, a half dozen direct state-funded projects. We had never had that before in preserving railroad heritage. The federal government creates Steamtown National Historic Site, which is a new national park in Pennsylvania. And many local attempts to fund and actually create institutions of railway heritage. Probably the most astonishing is what we call our Transportation Enhancement Program, a far-reaching federal program that directed a tiny proportion of federal highway funding to be used for heritage projects. Over the last 20 years, the total investment of what we call T-money has exceeded $600 million just in railway heritage projects. Now, it's a big country, 50 states in 20 years and a lot of relatively small grants, but that changed the texture and the whole focus of railway heritage preservation. We're still assessing the importance and the results of this period of transition. It's hard to know you're in a period of profound change when you're still in it. It'll be years more before we finally figure out what really happened. Now, I'm not really going to talk about the era of professionalization because we are all living it right now. It started a little while back. It's going to continue for a little while forward. It looks differently to different people in different places. It is happening more slowly and later in some countries. It happened earlier in Europe, perhaps. It means more credentials, more training, more procedure. Sometimes things will be more difficult. Sometimes things will be better. We don't know yet. And I don't need to remind you all that the world was vastly different now than it was just a decade ago. Not just globalization, not just the financial situation. We compete every day, ever more, with pop culture, with iPhones and iPads. International politics grows less stable. The complexity of daily life increases. We're all fighting bugs, rust, decay, fatigue. Our visitors grow older. Our demographics shift in unfortunate ways. We scramble to find new and interesting ways to entertain people and get them in the door. It's harder to keep up with the flood of new and useful technology and information. We have to do things now that were unthinkable or impossible just a few years ago. We have opportunities popping up, such as distance learning in universities, that we in historic preservation and railway heritage ought to be taking advantage of. But it's hard. Where do we find the time to become proficient in this entirely new technology? There are things that catch us unprepared all the time, and I could go on and on and on. This is absolutely the most difficult, complex, fraught, incredibly intense period I have ever experienced in 40 years of railway heritage and preservation. And frankly, I'm having a ball. Muchas gracias.
John, muchísimas gracias. También nosotros lo estamos pasando súper. Este repaso que nos hizo pasar por la historia del ferrocarril en Estados Unidos y el rescate, a veces bastante sui generis, es bien interesante. Bueno, y la clase de señales que nos dio, yo creo que todos la aprendimos. Te la van a volver a preguntar, ¿eh? Muchas gracias. Tenemos 10 minutos para preguntas, por si alguien está interesado o más tarde abordan a John.
Very good, thank you. Oh, is there a question? Do I need to wear that? Oh, okay. Oh, okay, already. Yes, I shall. Yes, I can. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Gracias. John, ¿cuál es la situación actual del transporte para pasajeros en los Estados Unidos? ¿Cuáles son las rutas ferroviarias que siguen vigentes?
No? I'm sorry, I'm here. Yes, I can hear you now. In the United States today, there are roughly 6 very large railroads, roughly a dozen middle-sized freight railroads, probably 300 small short-line railroads, and then Amtrak, and perhaps a dozen major commuter railroad operations. Our effective mileage is about 180,000, and the statistics change, but the freight railroads are hauling something like 3 times the freight they used to with half the employees, and the productivity has gotten very high. That's why they're able to why Kansas City Southern, for example, has been able to make such a good business with its extensions into Mexico. NAFTA has played a very strong role, and what I see is pretty much the continued integration of the freight railway systems of Canada, the US, and Mexico. And I think in 10 years we will see much closer cooperation. The projections in the US are for serious growth in freight traffic as our highways become crowded and our population increases. So it is a very good time to be in the railroad business in the United States.
Bueno, en 2008, debido a la crisis, fueron publicados planos de instalar un sistema de tren rápido de pasajero, similar al modelo chino o al modelo europeo. Como he oído, muchos de estos planes ya fueron cancelados. ¿Cómo es la situación actual?
I think, in general, the prospects for high-speed rail in the U.S. are tiny and diminishing. There are so many adverse factors. Real estate costs are very high. We have a highly developed system of airlines, hubs and spokes. We don't have the money to build the kind of system that, even in places like Ohio or California or the East Coast, what even supporters of light rail seem to miss is that in China, in Europe, in places where high-speed rail does work, all along the route and at either end, they have other public transportation systems to connect and feed that high-speed system, and we don't. So the system in California, for example, that's being proposed will take people from city to city, but once they get to that city, there's no real way to get them out into the suburbs or to other towns. So I think I think we're not going to have it. And we may have better passenger service in general, but we're not going to have high-speed rail. Our high-speed rail, we call them airplanes. Oh, partly, yeah. We may see, if we have successive oil crises, more emphasis on rail, but again, that'll be more local rail, and I think less high-speed rail. Anyone else with questions? Very good then. Thank you all very much. My pleasure. Oh, good. Thank you. Grab that cap. Yes.
Of a resource. From 1982 to about the year 2000, whenever the redevelopment of this site began, there was very little substantial capital funding available. Just grassroots funding, volunteer labor, in-kind donations, $1 and coins in the donation box type of fundraising, which, as you all know, doesn't provide much capital funding for the types of expenses that we come up against. In 2000 and 2003, we started to get HUD grants. HUD stands for Housing and Urban Development. And these grants provide funding for things as simple as roofs and windows, just the basics to keep the weather out of the building to be able to start to preserve it. 2003 to 2006, we got our first disbursement of what the city and county that we're in refers to as SPLOST funding. I'm going to explain that in more detail in a minute. 2007, we received some funding from the state of Georgia in the form of state bonds, but there were very many restrictions on how that money could be used. And primarily, they didn't want to own any railroad tracks. They didn't want to own any rolling stock. They didn't want to be involved in any building that touched another building. So it very quickly limited how we could use this money. So we came up with this concept of a land swap. The land that the Battlefield Park and our adjacent parking lot is on, we simply swapped the value of this land for the in-kind cash with the state, so then the cash could be used and spent freely without all of these restrictions. 2006 to 2012, we got another disbursement of the SPLOST fundings. 2009, the Savannah Children's Museum began its private funding, which was eventually matched by the Paul Newman Foundation. Are you all familiar with the actor Paul Newman? His foundation matched our funding for the Children's Museum, which really is what allowed us to build the first phase exploration station. And we continue to look ahead to more SPLOST funding, funding from the state of Georgia, city capital improvement projects, federal grants, and private funding through the Coastal Heritage Society. This SPLOST funding that I mentioned, what SPLOST stands for is Special Purpose Local Option Sales Tax. And what this is a financing method for funding capital outlay projects in the state of Georgia. It's an optional 1% sales tax levied by the county for the use of schools, improvement to roads, other public facilities. The revenue that's generated can't be used towards operating expenses or capital improvement projects. So you're probably wondering, why am I talking about taxes? Nobody likes taxes, but without this tax, without this funding that we got through this tax, we never would have been able to restore the museum and develop the museum the way we have. It was really the key for us to be able to do what we've done. So the next component of my talk here has to do a lot more with the layering of history on the site that we encompass, and how that history just can't be ignored. We don't focus only on the Railroad Museum. We interpret all of the different components of history that are involved. Colonization of Savannah occurred in 1733. The land that we're on, we found archaeological remains of Native American artifacts, colonial artifacts. So we interpret those artifacts along with the rest of the history. The Revolutionary War, of course, as I said, once again, we found archaeological remains from the battle. We know that the battle occurred on the property where the Railroad Museum is. Therefore, we built the Battlefield Memorial Park to commemorate that battle. Of course, the American Civil War. This image shows some of the destruction that occurred during that war. We were actually very lucky when General Sherman commenced with his famous March to the Sea, destroying and burning everything in his path. Whenever he got to Savannah, he saved Savannah. He didn't destroy it. And he actually presented it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. So our shops, our repair shops, our railroad, all of the buildings in the downtown area were spared. So we have a much older history in our area than most of the adjacent towns have, because we weren't destroyed during that war. General Sherman actually used the railroad repair shops to repair his cannons and military equipment. So there was another benefit to not destroying the shops to him. The Ogeechee Canal, this is a canal that is directly adjacent to the railroad shops. The viaduct that you see in the picture is actually a bridge that all the trains have to cross to access the passenger depot or the shops complex. And this canal is how all of the goods and the cotton from the interior of the state were brought to Savannah before the development of the railroad. Of course, a canal is not a very efficient way to move goods, which is really what spurred the interest and the need to build the railroad. However, the canal is still there. We preserve it, and we interpret it as a part of the program at the museum. And then, of course, the Central Georgia Railway, which is built on top of all of this other history. This is a 1923 bird's eye view of the entire complex. The repair shops are on the left side of the image. It also shows the business offices, the freight warehouses, and the cotton storage yard. It's a huge complex, over 30 acres. The repair shops themselves are about 14 acres. So a very large and vast facility. This diagram shows how far the Central Georgia Railway stretched out into the adjacent states. The railroad went north to South Carolina, west to Tennessee and Alabama, south to Florida. It was one of the largest railroads for a number of years in the world, actually, but it was quickly surpassed as industry progressed. I put this in here as an example of loss. This black and white image is Union Station. It was not a passenger station for the Central Georgia Railroad, but a shared station for the Atlantic Coast Line and Seaboard Airline Railroads. And unfortunately, this beautiful building was torn down for nothing more but the ability to build an off-ramp from a highway. You can see the modern images there show a gas station, and to the left is the entrance to the highway. And it's just a terrible shame that there was such a lack of respect for these types of buildings and architecture for a period of time in the United States. This is some examples of worker housing in the railroad district, which we call Frogtown. I'm not really sure how it got that name exactly, but there are several of these worker houses still standing, and we've managed to save the last two. The yellow house that you see there and the white house were on a piece of property that had been sold, and the new owner wanted to demolish them, tear them down. We were able to purchase the buildings from the new owner and actually move the buildings off of the property onto an adjacent piece of property which the Coastal Heritage Society owns. So there are only 4 examples of these houses left. We were able to preserve them. The image in the upper left-hand corner, believe it or not, is actually a hotel, which is directly adjacent to the Railroad Museum. The zoning that the city of Savannah has set forth requires that any new construction that's adjacent to a historic site has to be sensitive to that site. So they built several of the new structures to look like the Frogtown houses. So we're actually very, very happy about that development. So once again, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the significance of this site. It was a very, very expansive shop complex and railroad facility, one of the largest in the country of its type. This is one of the earliest depictions of the shops, and I wanted to point out in this drawing, this bird's eye view drawing, you can see that the roundhouse is indeed a complete circle. The original roundhouse, which was constructed between 1853 and 1855, was constructed in this manner. And I wanted to point out something else. This portion of land here, in this portion of land here, you can see that there's no development on the portion of land on the left side of the image. And that area there is actually private industry. The railroad, at the time of this drawing, the railroad did not own that property. The property that the railroad had built the shops on was actually granted to them by the city of Savannah. The city of Savannah realized that this was a very good development for the city. The property was city-owned, so they simply gave this property to the railroad to build these shops. And the reason I'm telling you this is that 150 years later, the fact that this land was given to the railroad by the city became very important. The land, which was owned by the Central Georgia Railroad, had changed hands to the Southern Railway, which later became the Norfolk and Southern Railway. So up into the late 70s, after the railroad, the late 60s, after the railroad had stopped using this site, they had abandoned it. Well, somebody had the sense to research the deeds of the properties all the way back to when the city gave this property to the Central of Georgia Railroad. And somebody was smart enough to include a revisionary clause, which stated that if the railroad ever abandoned the property or stopped using it for its intended purpose, the city would reclaim ownership of the property. So the original property that the shops were on, the ownership was simply reverted back to the city. The other portions of land that I pointed out were not a part of that agreement. So Norfolk Southern Railroad still owned those parcels up until right around the year 2000. So in this image, you can see the roundhouse looks a little different. By 1925, steam locomotives had gotten bigger, primarily longer. They couldn't even fit on the turntable or in the original roundhouse anymore. So the railroad built an addition to the roundhouse, which extended its depth by 68 feet. You can see the addition here. They did leave the other side of the roundhouse standing for a period of time. Unfortunately, due to its ineffectiveness in repairing the steam locomotives, because they couldn't use the bays, it was also eventually torn down. This image is 1950. This is near the end of the use of the site. You can see how it has grown. The construction has extended to all of the boundaries of the property. It has full repair shops for coaches and freight equipment, a transfer table, storehouse, oil house, blacksmith shop, everything that the railroad could possibly need to repair a steam locomotive or passenger coach or any type of freight equipment. So in 1962, the site was completely abandoned by the railroad. All of the rolling stock was removed. Not one piece of equipment, not one locomotive were left behind. All of the tools were removed. All of the machines were removed. Nothing, literally nothing was left but the masonry structures that housed the shops. And it was left. They closed the gates, put a lock on it, and walked away. They didn't even leave one caretaker there to care for the property. So from 1962 until about 1987, the property was completely abandoned and left to nature. Now, I want to use two examples. Whenever people, railroad historians or people interested in railroad history visit our site, they always compare us to two other similar facilities. This is called the East Broad Top. It's in Rock Hill, PA. It was a coal mining operation. And the facility is a little bit smaller than ours, but it has all the basic components of a locomotive repair facility, roundhouse, machine shop, other blacksmith shop, a foundry. But the difference here is when this facility went out of service, it was like they just closed the doors and walked away and left it. All the tools are there, the equipment was still there. And even though there was a period of time that it wasn't necessarily cared for, whenever it was identified as a resource, all they had to do was open the doors, repair the buildings, knock the dust off, and it's just a great preserved example of these types of facilities. Another example is in Jamestown, California, 1897. This was the repair shops for a timber harvesting operation. Once again, when the facility stopped being used, they didn't destroy it. They just left everything where it was and closed the doors. And whenever it opened again, however many years later, It was an instant tourist attraction and industrial heritage site. Our site, on the other hand, was completely abandoned. You can see from these photos how far the deterioration had gone. Trees were beginning to grow up. Just total abandonment. Roofs were failing, windows were failing. So the images that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation was kind of backwards. I'm taking you through this backwards. I show you what we are now, what we've accomplished, and now I'm going to take you from how far gone the site was back up through the restoration. These are two similar images as restoration had begun. You can see that a lot of the trees and overgrowth have been removed. Majority of the buildings have new roofs. There's now more rolling stock on the property. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about the entity as a historic landmark and what those designations mean and how we've approached the preservation and the restoration of the site. The entire complex, which I've already showed you many images through the years of the complex, but the entire property that was owned by the Centro of Georgia, you can see the plat below, including the repair shops, the passenger depot, the freight warehouses, and also the two viaducts that the trains use to access these buildings. This is all designated as a National Historic Landmark District. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. What does that mean? This is in your outline as well, so you can read along. The National Register of Historic Places is the official list of our nation's historic places worthy of preservation, authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. The National Park Service's National Register of Historic Places is part of a national program to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological resources. However, this designation does not provide any protection or funding. National Historic Landmark. This is a little bit different. National Historic Landmarks are nationally significant historic places designated by the Secretary of the Interior because they possess exceptional value or quality in illustrating or interpreting the heritage of the United States. Today, fewer than 2,500 historic places bear this national distinction. Working with citizens throughout the nation, the National Historic Landmarks Program draws upon the expertise of National Park Service staff who work to nominate these new landmarks and provide assistance to the existing landmarks. Now, this does provide some protection. There has to be some caveats in place to help protect these landmarks, but once again, no real guarantees that they are protected from private enterprise. So the Secretary of the Interior has developed several approaches to historic preservation, which we use as guidelines when we are looking at a preservation project. And I wanted to talk a little bit about these. Now, I realize you're probably familiar with these concepts, but the different approaches to preservation do have some different connotations on how the property is treated and interpreted. Of course, preservation is simply the conservation, as little intervention as possible, the gentlest means possible to preserve the artifact, whether it's a building or a piece of rolling stock, whatever it may be. The act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of historic property, work, including preliminary measures to protect and stabilize the property, generally focuses on the ongoing maintenance and repair of historic materials and features rather than extensive replacement and new construction. New exterior additions are not within the scope of this treatment. However, the limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems and other code-required work to make the properties functional is appropriate within a preservation project. The next approach, rehabilitation. We also call this adaptive reuse. The act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, or architectural values. The next approach, restoration, essentially returning the artifact to the way it was at a specific point in time. The act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it appeared at a particular period of time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. The limited and sensitive upgrading of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems and other code-required work to make properties functional is appropriate within a restoration project. Of course, the final approach is reconstruction. You're completely rebuilding and interpreting a lost artifact. The act or process of depicting by means of new construction the form, features, and detailing of a non-surviving site, landscape, building, structure, or object for the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period of time and in its historic location. The next thing I want to talk about, John mentioned earlier, are HABS, Hair and House programs. HABS stands for, HABS stands for the Historic American Building Survey. HAIR stands for the Historic American Engineering Record. And HOUS stands for the Historic American Landscape Survey. And these were the documentation programs that started in the 1930s, but were carried on up into as late as 1980. And John talked about how these programs started and why they started. I've experienced their effect and benefit 50 years later. In the restoration of our site, we have constantly referred back to these records, drawings and photographs that were taken in the 1970s. Even though the site had already deteriorated quite a bit, there was still a lot of historic fabric there to be documented. So as we're reconstructing and restoring buildings, we can refer to these drawings and photographs to see what the components really looked like that we no longer have. And it's something that you should consider. You know, if you don't have funding or the impetus to actually restore a piece of equipment, restore a building, or obtain possession of it, at very least do as much as you can to document its condition at this point in time, because somebody in the future will benefit from that work. As we go through the rest of the images here, the majority of the historic images, the black and white images that you're going to see, are from Historic American Engineering Record. So I'm going to go through each of the buildings on the site, not in great detail, but just so you can see the condition of each building and how far the restoration had to come. And keep in mind that this work has occurred over, essentially over a 30-year period. It's taken a lot of time and patience and money, but it will let you know that there's hope to accomplish the things that may seem unattainable now. Just once again, some overall images of the repair shops complex during the highest point of abandonment, and then as we started to bring things back. This is the passenger station. Fortunately, it was one of the buildings that was kept in repair during the period of abandonment. It now houses the Savannah Visitor Center. So the majority of the people that visit Savannah, the first place they go is to the old train depot to get the information on the other activities that there are to see, or the other things that there are to see in the city. The train shed, this is the train shed that is behind the passenger depot. So all of the passenger trains would shove into this shed, and the passengers would get on and off the train. The train shed now houses the Savannah History Museum. We refer to this as the Roundhouse Stack Yard. This is where the smokestack is that ventilated the fires from the stationary boilers and the forges in the blacksmith shop. But this is one of the most dramatic images of how far gone the facility was and how far we've brought it back with the restoration. The dispatch office, this building is actually connected to the Roundhouse. This is where all the scheduling of the employees, all the engineer, firemen, conductors, the scheduling of their duties would take place here. And then they would send messengers out into the town to inform those employees of their duties. Of course, before telephone, telegraph. Once again, these are hair images from the early 1970s. You can see that the building had no windows, no roof, and it's been completely restored. It now houses the gift shop and the ticketing office for the Railroad Museum. The overnight shed, this is a term which actually I've been told over the years that might not be a very accurate term. Our roundhouse is separated into two components. One we refer to as the back shops, where heavier repairs took place on the locomotives. And the other side of the roundhouse we refer to as the overnight sheds, meaning that the locomotives would stay there overnight while they're waiting for their morning duties. The accuracy of that nomenclature we're not too sure about. Another view of the roundhouse. You can see the weeds growing up, the deterioration, the stagnant condition of the turntable, and how far it's come back to life. The turntable itself is fully operational. As I described, we use it every day on our daily train ride operations. It's been completely rebuilt. All the bearings, gears, electric motors have been completely disassembled, repaired as needed, and reassembled. The machine shop, unfortunately, is a building that could not be saved. The image on the left is the early 70s during the Hare survey. The image on the upper right is a later image which shows the full collapse of the roof simply due to neglect and deterioration. And of course the color photo is what it looks like today. It's a very nice open space. We have many events there, but unfortunately none of the timber frame structure could be saved. This is the tender frame shop. The lower portion of the building was part of the original 1853 to 1855 construction. They would actually build the wooden frames for the locomotive tenders in this building, and they would be moved to the machine shop, which is adjacent to this structure, where all of the other metal components and trucks would be placed under the tender, and it would be put out into service. Once again, you can see how far deteriorated this structure was. It's been completely restored. The second story was added in 1924 as an air brake shop. As the Westinghouse air brake and the air brake technology came into play, the railroad needed a place to repair and maintain the valves and the air brake equipment. So the second floor of that building was used specifically for that purpose. The building now houses the offices of our Historic Preservation Department. We have a full staff that is dedicated to the preservation of the building, the site, and rolling stock. So a very good example of an adaptive reuse. The workers' garden. The site was constructed with a space set aside for a garden. This was typical in railroad construction. Many passenger stations, depots, and even shops complexes had gardens. It was the only place on the site where you could essentially get away from the grit and grime of what was going on there. They didn't allow any materials or parts or coal or oil or anything to be stored in this area. It was to be kept as a beautiful space for the workers to have a place to go to get away from their job, essentially. We completely reconstructed the garden. There wasn't anything left of it when we started the restoration. This photo is a photo of engineering interns. This photo was taken in the 1930s. And this is the photo that we used to reconstruct the garden. You can just see, barely see the layout of the pathways. And on the right side of the image, you can see the edge of the pond, which is in the garden. So we used that to replicate the construction of the pond. The smokestack. The time of construction, this was somewhat of an engineering marvel. The smokestack has three functions. Not only does it draw the smoke off of the fires of the stationary boilers and the forges in the blacksmith shop, but the cast iron component that you see there was actually a water tank. It was spring-fed and also caught the rainwater that hit the stack. And this water was used to feed the locomotive boilers, the stationary boilers. And then the small doors around the base of the stack, one of the most common questions from our visitors, what are these small doors for? Well, these were the privies. These were the bathrooms, the water closets for the people that worked on the site. These were the only water closets available on the site at that time. And you can look at the benefits in two ways. In the winter, it was warm in there because of the smokestack. In the summer, it must have been deathly hot. But because they had this water source and the ability to build underground culverts to take the waste away, they had some form of an early flushing commode in there as early as 1853. The blacksmith shop, of course you all know blacksmithing is a huge part of early railroading. To be able to make parts strong enough to withstand the stresses that occur in a steam locomotive and other rolling stock, you needed a good supply of forged iron. The blacksmith shop was also very badly deteriorated. You can see walls were collapsing, roofs were collapsing. It's been completely restored. A portion of it is interpreted as a blacksmith shop. Another portion of the building is reserved for event space. This is the boiler house. This building housed a stationary boiler and a stationary steam engine. Steam engine drove a line shaft. The line shaft ran through all of the buildings of the site. This is how all of the machines were powered up until the advent of electricity, when the machines were fit with their own electric motors. Unfortunately, like I said, all of those machines, all of the components of the line shaft, steam engine, boiler had all been removed whenever the site was abandoned. At one point in time, the railroad had actually removed the front of the building, which you see in the black and white photo, and they built an addition on the front of the building to store materials. Well, we restored the building, took it back to the way that it looked during its original construction. Storehouse, this was a later addition to the shop's complex, built in 1925. It simply stored all the goods that the railroad needed to make the repairs on the equipment. There's a track that goes along the loading dock of the storehouse so that they could just pull boxcars right up to the side of the storehouse, unload the goods, reload other goods that needed to be taken out. So very high efficiency. Carpentry shop. This is also one of the original 1853, 1855 constructed buildings, which now houses a portion of the Savannah Children's Museum. These are just some more views of the carpentry shop to show, even after the last time it burned, and it was just left to deteriorate, the entire basement had become completely filled with vegetation and debris. So all that had to be removed before we could even start the construction of the Exploration Station Children's Activity Area. The coach shop and transfer table. This was built in 1924 for the repair and maintenance of passenger and freight equipment. One thing that I don't think has been talked about today is a transfer table. It's less common than a turntable, but in the United States there were quite a few of them. Essentially, you have a pit which has a series of rails installed in the pit, and then there's a bridge on wheels similar to the turntable, but rather than it spinning radially, it could be moved side to side. So you'd bring your piece of equipment onto the transfer table, whatever it may be, and move it side to side until it lines up with whatever door you need to bring the equipment into the shop. So it's a rectangular oriented shop rather than a roundhouse. Once again, these are just some images of what will be housed in the next phase of the Savannah Children's Museum. The indoor component will be inside of that coach shop. We're going to build a replica sailing ship. On one side it will be a sailing ship, the other side will be a modern cargo ship to interpret the maritime heritage of Savannah as one of the United States' busiest seaports. But of course all on a level for children to understand and interpret. This is the courtyard that's a part of the Savannah Children's Museum. Originally it was used as a stripping yard. The railroad would strip the paint off of the equipment in this outdoor yard before it went into the shop to be repainted. This is the paint shop. Massive facility. The unique thing about this building is that the rolling stock is actually housed on the second floor. And this has brought up an interesting question recently. The Federal Railroad Administration has recently stiffened up their rules, made the rules regarding bridges more difficult, requiring more inspections, more maintenance, more repair. And in their definition of bridges, a bridge is defined by any span greater than 10 feet. So our turntable has fallen under this guideline. So although we keep our turntable in good repair and maintain it well, we have to inspect it or have it inspected by a professional engineer every year. So as we were addressing this issue, we started wondering, well, is this entire building a bridge? The building is still under restoration. We haven't put any rolling stock of any significant weight inside the building, but it's a severe challenge that we're up against right now. Whether or not we're actually going to be able to or be able to afford to ever put any heavy rolling stock in this building again. Hopefully we can get through this and move ahead, but it's a real, there's a lot of uncertainty right now on how we're going to be able to use this building. Due to the period of abandonment, this building was abandoned for almost 60 years. The rain was allowed to come inside the building and deteriorate very much of it. It's been restored, but it still has many weaknesses. The lower portion of the building housed all of the support shops that were needed for the repairs. It had carpentry shops, upholstery shops, small bronze foundry for hardware, handles, fasteners. Anything that the railroad needed to repair their equipment could be done in this building. Very self-sufficient. Okay, now on to rolling stock. Before I start with the rolling stock collection, I wanted to touch on something that John talked about earlier. This period of time where everybody was trying to develop a preservation plan for railroad heritage, and they were just grabbing everything that they could get their hands on, including rolling stock. Well, we missed that. We are a very, very young museum. We didn't even start collecting rolling stock until the late 90s. So that's probably about 25 or 30 years after all the really good stuff was being snatched up by other railroad museums, private collectors. So it was a challenge to even begin a rolling stock collection. And essentially, even though we're very proud of our collection, it's essentially all of the castaways that other museums didn't want, things that had been forgotten and were left to rot. So just like all the buildings that I just showed you, these components were so far gone that the restoration alone was very challenging. We weren't even thinking about interpretation. We were thinking about, how do we keep this thing from falling apart? So I'm going to talk about the locomotives first. This is one of the few surviving Central Georgia steam locomotives. An 060 tank engine was used in switching service in the Macon shops in Macon, Georgia. When the railroad took it out of service, it eventually ended up with a scrap dealer. But thank heavens he didn't cut it up. He had the sense to save it. And eventually it was donated to our museum for restoration. The Atlantic Steel Company number 1, another tank engine, 040 wheel configuration. This is a very, very small locomotive, but it is standard gauge. It was used for moving just one car at a time, whether it be coal or coke or ore at a steel company. Central of Georgia, number 403 in its tender. This is a 460 steam locomotive. Once again, one of the very few Central Georgia locomotives that survived. And I want to point out something about this that's an important thing to consider when you're developing your museums. You can see in the image on the upper right hand, this locomotive is actually in the Savannah History Museum. It's not at the Georgia State Railroad Museum. This was the very first locomotive to be preserved as a part of Savannah's heritage. But notice that it's been separated from its tender. The picture of the tender in the lower right-hand corner is in the roundhouse at the Georgia State Railroad Museum. Now, whoever was developing the museum, the history museum at the time, thought that this was a good idea. We know now it's not a good idea. You lose a lot of context when you separate a steam locomotive from its tender, especially for those that are just learning. You know, you lose a component of the learning process if something's just completely missing and you have to walk across the street to look at it. So don't do this if you can. Central of Georgia 223, this is a 280 consolidation, another one of the few Central of Georgia locomotives surviving. This was what we call a park engine. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. Slap a coat of paint on it, put it out in the park, and let it start to rust. And that's where this locomotive was. It was in a park in Columbus, Georgia. Whenever the Georgia State Railroad Museum was designated, they were aware and they wanted this locomotive to be preserved, and they knew that we could take better care of it than they could, so it was transported from Columbus to Savannah, and it's now in our roundhouse for preservation. This is what we refer to as the Savannah Central number 30. Now, the Savannah Central is a name that we've created for our little tourist operation at the museum. We had to designate a specific name in order to identify the locomotive to the Federal Railroad Administration whenever we're submitting our inspection reports. So we couldn't reuse the Central of Georgia's name, so we came up with this name, Savannah Central. Now, this locomotive, it doesn't have much context with the site. It was just built as an industrial switch engine for a contracting company. But eventually it ended up at a power plant in Georgia, moving the coal cars around for the power plant. So it has some relevance to Georgia history, but because of its completeness, still had all of its components, it was a good candidate for operational restoration. So we completely restored this locomotive, every nut and bolt, up to the compliance requirements for the Federal Railroad Administration. And we operate this locomotive 92 days a year for the education and enjoyment of our visitors. The Holly Hill Lumber Company, number 15. This is a 242 Columbia style locomotive. It was built for a logging company to extract timber from the woods and take them to the lumber mill. It doesn't have much local context, but it does have regional context. It was used in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in the timber industry. This locomotive is actually privately owned, but it's been donated to the museum, and we are also restoring this locomotive for operation. This is a very good example of how to approach how not to approach a locomotive restoration. This project started because of desire. The museum wanted to do it, the owner wanted to do it, and there wasn't a whole lot of assessment done on the locomotive. We just decided, we have some money, we're going to start, we can do this. Well, after we took the locomotive apart, we found out that the leading truck and the trailing truck, neither one of them were original to the locomotive. It was something that had been put on the locomotive for display, just something to look at, purely infunctional. So we're now having to completely research and reconstruct the appropriate type of truck to put in the front and the rear of the locomotive. As you could imagine, it's very expensive. We also found out after further investigation that the boiler itself had just too many problems to repair and put back into service. So we're actually in the process of constructing a brand new boiler from scratch to put back on this locomotive. So we've started a restoration which is really going to turn into a reconstruction. Only about 85% about 85% of this locomotive will be new. But that's not a bad thing. When we start running it, we're going to know what we have. We're going to know the condition. And it's going to give us many years of service. This is just one of the drawings that had to be completed in order to fabricate that new boiler. This is one drawing in a set of about 25 that details every component, every part and piece, every detail of the boiler. This is something that I've been very involved in, working very closely with our engineer and our consultant to make sure that everything's right, because this has to fit on an existing frame. No modifications will be allowed. So this is something that really isn't going on. This really isn't happening very many places, building a new boiler for a steam locomotive. So it's been a very interesting process, and one that we hope to share with other museums that have to do this. I put this image here in as another example. This is a Central of Georgia locomotive that's in a park in Macon, Georgia. The city owns it. And recently, a local short line railroad has struck a deal with the city. They've leased this locomotive from the city with the hopes of restoring it and putting it into tourist service. Now, it's a great idea. Everybody in this room would probably be in favor of something like that. But after reading the news copy and the media, they've grossly underestimated the cost of this, what it's going to cost to do this. And I've had some conversations with some people involved, and I said, be very careful. Don't let them take this locomotive apart before they know that they have the funding that they need to do it and do it right. Or else it's going to be a bunch of parts in a warehouse somewhere. And the longer a locomotive sits in parts, the easier it is to forget where everything goes. Now on to some diesels. This is the Central of Georgia SW1. This was the first diesel locomotive that the Central of Georgia Railroad ever acquired. And we were lucky enough that it was still intact and we could get it back for the museum. This is a Davenport switch engine. This is actually the very first piece of operational motive power that the museum has had. It was the only thing that we had that we could move equipment around with. This is one of two General Electric 44-tonners that we use for our daily train ride operation. We purchased these from a small short line railroad in Claremont, New Hampshire. And one of the negotiations that we made with them, one of the diesel engines required rebuild. And we didn't really have the expertise at that time at the museum to do that type of work. So we said to them, can we send some of our staff to work with you and your mechanics on the rebuilding of this engine? And they said yes. Of course, we were paying them to do the majority of the work. But myself and two others had the opportunity to go work with their mechanics, completely rebuild one of the engines in the locomotives. So now we have this knowledge to pass on to other people at our museum as we continue to maintain and operate these locomotives. That's the other one. Another thing that I didn't mention, I had mentioned that the bridge that accessed the shops complex had been removed. Without that bridge, we cannot bring any equipment into the site on rails. So every piece of equipment that we have has had to be brought in by truck and crane. I have about 6 minutes, so I'm gonna move quickly through the passenger equipment, the rest of the equipment. This is a GP35 EMD locomotive. Okay, now we're on to the passenger and freight equipment. This is our oldest piece of equipment. This is a coach built in 1880. Luckily, it was privately owned, and that owner kept very good care of it. It even still had the trucks and the truss rods and all of the mechanical components intact, even though it had essentially been used for a camp, a place to stay in the wilderness. This is Georgia Railroad number 67. John Hankey actually had a lot of involvement in the recovery of this coach. The coach is marked as being constructed in 1911. However, the style of construction is that of much earlier all-wood construction. So we still have a lot of research to do on this coach to really determine when it was built. This is one of our office cars. The presidents of the railroad would travel in these cars when they conducted business. They're outfitted with staterooms for sleeping, parlors, dining rooms, kitchen. Georgia Northern Railway combination car. We're actually restoring this for another railroad. We do not own this. We're restoring it for a heritage center in Albany, Georgia, because they don't have a repair facility, but they do interpret their railroad heritage. So once it's complete, it'll be moved across the state and be put on display in their museum. Central Georgia 5341 passenger car. This is a Pullman, which is currently used as office space. Central Georgia combination car 374. We just acquired this recently. We had purchased it from another railroad museum about 10 years ago, but finally just moved it to the museum earlier this year. And this is a very good example of a conservation project where we are preserving the changes through time. The car was converted to maintenance of way, and it was used as a bunkhouse, sleeping quarters for the men that were working on the tracks. So it has a kitchen, 8 bunks, a locker room, and a compartment with a generator so that they had electricity for the work that they were doing and electricity for the car. So we have literally just cleaned the car in that condition and opened it up for the public so that they can see how the men that worked on the railroad would live. This is an outside braced boxcar built in 1918. Central Georgia caboose, showing there us offloading it and retrucking it. Central Georgia baggage car. This is a refrigerator car. This was one of those discards that I talked about. The Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, Pennsylvania had this in their collection, and they were going to do away with it because they had a duplicate. Well, we took it and restored it. And see how badly deteriorated the siding is there. We had to completely replace all the siding. And I want to point out the image in the upper left-hand corner. You see how the boxcar is kind of tilted, skewed. Structurally, it wasn't holding itself up anymore. It was starting to lean and was out of square. So we had to build some steel frames on the inside to straighten it out and hold it in place. Atlantic Coastline steel caboose. Another of our Central Georgia office cars. This is another discard. This boxcar was on a siding not far from the Railroad Museum, but it had left to rot. You can see how badly deteriorated it is. There was no paint left on it, all rust, and we restored it back to its original appearance. Central Georgia Railway post office car. Another recent acquisition, yeah, I see you have one in your collection. I'm eager to see it. Small crane. Southern Railway steel side bay caboose. Southern Railway dining car, which was actually originally a coach, but the seats had been removed, so we converted it to a dining car for our restaurant. Norfolk and Western box car. This is the coach that we use for our passenger service, which we built in our shops from a 40-foot flat car. We built it to mimic the appearance of an 1880s style of coach. And this is a piece of equipment that unfortunately we did not acquire, but we seriously considered acquiring this piece of equipment. You can see how badly deteriorated it is. We were going to have to disassemble it to move it back to the museum. The reason that we really wanted to get this is it was one of the most significant remaining pieces of Central Georgia rolling stock. It was a segregated coach, separate seating compartments for African Americans and for whites. Even though slavery had been abolished many years before, segregation was alive and well up until the early 1960s. So this was really the only piece of Central Georgia passenger equipment surviving that we could interpret that part of history. Just a couple more quick things. The city of Savannah also has one streetcar, but it's very interesting because it's been converted to a hybrid propulsion system. It doesn't need the overhead wire. It is still electric. It has a very small, very efficient generator on board, which provides the electricity needed to move the streetcar up and down the street. And the city, it's been very successful so far. The city hopes to build on this program with more streetcars. These are two Bernie streetcars that are at the museum, which did originally run in Savannah. So we're hoping to restore these and use the same hybrid propulsion system as used on the other. And this is my last slide, and I popped this in here to leave you with a closing thought. I was invited to give a presentation at the Savannah College of Art and Design earlier this year in the preservation department, which I'm a graduate of, and they said you could talk about anything you want. So it was I had a really hard time deciding what I wanted to talk about. So I came up with this concept of talking about not how to preserve wood or preserve steel, but how to preserve knowledge, how to preserve know-how. The term know-how means that somebody can go out, pick up the tools, do the work properly. So the gist of the preservation, or the gist of the presentation was, go out, learn how to do something, and teach somebody else how to do that. We can sit here and talk about what we do, how to plan a museum, how to have a restoration plan. But we also need to go out and really learn how to do the things that are being lost, and then teach somebody else how to do that. I had used this image. Most of you probably recognize. This is the control stand, the back head of a steam locomotive, and I used this image as my first slide. And I asked the students. I said, "Does anybody have any idea what this is?" And nobody knew what it was. But after I described it, explained what it was, they started to understand. And I told them, 12 years ago, I didn't know what that was, but now I know everything about it, and I want to teach other people the same. Thank you very much.
Buenas tardes. ¿Sí se escucha bien? Sí. Bueno, muy bien. La plática que voy a dar es sobre los trabajos de conservación y restauración en las colecciones del museo. Si quieres, bueno, acá no esté. En, Cuando estaba armando este documento, empecé pensando en hacer primero un desglose de lo que son las colecciones, explicándolas, de las categorías, etcétera, pero me di cuenta de que solo hacer eso es ya es todo un tratado. Entonces mejor un resumen muy breve del tipo de material que hay, y más bien hablar sobre algunos ejemplos de las intervenciones, que creo que eso puede ser más útil. Puede ser más útil para ver, ¿no? Son introductorios. Por ejemplo, es un ejemplo de una revista del Fondo Ferronales. Al igual que una gran parte de nuestro material documental, sufre problemas de acidez en el papel. Entonces, tanto este fondo como el fondo de archivo tiene el problema de que es muy frágil el papel ya. Entonces, ese es uno de los problemas. Bueno, una foto de un plano. Este es el ejemplo del archivo histórico. Una gran cantidad de nuestra documentación del archivo histórico está en precisamente esas condiciones. El papel muy ácido, yurex en las orillas, y hemos estado haciendo tratamientos, digamos, a archivos seleccionados, pero el volumen de la colección significa que estamos buscando una manera de hacer esto ya a un nivel mucho más grande, porque son kilómetros de archivo. Entonces es claro de que tratamiento de hoja por hoja nunca va a poder solucionar esto. Bueno, este no está. Bueno, y este ya es uno de los primeros ejemplos donde quiero hablar acerca de hasta dónde llegamos en los tratamientos. Estas son unas piezas que se llaman palas acanaladoras. Se utilizaban en fundición parece ser que los canales por donde iba a fluir el metal cuando se arman. Tenemos el juego completo. Y aquí no sé si se alcanza a distinguir en la imagen. En la izquierda es como estaba originalmente y en la derecha ya es después de una limpieza. Aquí digamos que lo que estamos haciendo es solo quitar la corrosión activa y dejar la pieza estable, y hasta ahí. No tiene una capa de protección porque hemos estado, después de estudiar estos casos a través de muchos años, en realidad las condiciones son muy estables de esta pieza, entonces no lo requiere. Aplicarle una capa de protección ya implicaría modificar mucho su aspecto visual, cambia mucho. Entonces, este es un ejemplo importante de tipo de tratamientos que hacemos. Conservamos la autenticidad de la pieza lo más posible y hacemos la mínima intervención. Un caso similar sería con esta pieza. Esta pieza en realidad lo único que requiere es cuidados de conservación, no más. Aquí el riesgo es tratar de limpiarlo, porque si alguien lo limpia de manera equivocada, echaría a perder la pieza. O sea, se perdería toda la pátina, que es una pátina hermosa que tiene esta pieza. Entonces, este es el tipo de detalles que tenemos mucho cuidado al trabajar estas colecciones. Un caso similar con esta pieza. Y esto es algo que a través de los años hemos ido, cada vez estamos más convencidos de que esta es la manera en la que debemos de tratar este tipo de fondos, por lo menos. Ahora, la pátina no solo es al acabado en los metales como el bronce. También esta pieza tiene su pátina. También piezas así, hacemos una mínima intervención, conservamos los desgastes naturales, hasta otras marcas antiguas que se pusieron durante su historia en ferrocarriles. Bueno, este es más bien un ejemplo de inventario del marcaje de piezas. Otro de los aspectos importantes es la documentación que hacemos de los procesos y de las piezas. Tenemos la enorme ventaja de que contamos con el centro de documentación. Casi todas las piezas de la colección que pasan por el laboratorio, podemos encontrar referencias, algunas muy exactas, en catálogos, manuales. Por ejemplo, este es un ejemplo de un taladro manual para perforar riel. Así, y tenemos una pieza muy parecida a esa. Bueno, esto, aunque la imagen no corresponde exactamente, también tenemos piezas que son, por ejemplo, clavos de vía, tornillos, material de ese tipo. Aquí lo que hemos hecho es que seleccionamos una muestra, que es la que se formará parte de las colecciones, y esa es la que se conserva, como se da de alto en el inventario, se conserva como tal, y lo demás no, porque si no tenemos un problema de que tendríamos después que conservar todo y darle seguimiento al inventario de todo. Entonces lo hacemos de esa manera, pero no queremos perderlos todos, porque aunque aparentemente tenemos muchos, estamos pensando en el futuro, siempre conservar todos los elementos que tenemos. Bueno, ya hablando sobre el equipo rodante, aquí las condiciones significan que sí tenemos que hacer intervenciones más agresivas. En estos dos ejemplos se ven dos casos de piezas que están en condiciones muy distintas. El de arriba está a la intemperie y el de abajo está en un museo con clima controlado. Lo que esto significa es que en el caso de la pieza de abajo, que es un furgón que se encuentra en el Museo Memoria y Tolerancia, podemos hacer un tratamiento mucho más detallado, podemos conservar mucho más los elementos originales en las capas de pintura. Si está a la intemperie, de alguna manera para proteger la pieza sí tenemos que hacer una intervención mucho más agresiva que no se haría si estuviera en otras condiciones. Bueno, otro elemento importante es que hasta los escudos reglamentarios nacionales de México, los trabajadores de ferrocarriles hacían su interpretación de cada uno, los pintaban a mano. Entonces podemos encontrar una variedad de escudos, cada uno distinto. Ese tipo de cosas son las que tenemos mucho cuidado de conservar cuando hacemos cualquier tratamiento. Es otro ejemplo de otro escudo. Todos estos escudos son de unidades que están aquí en el museo, nada más. Sí, parte de nuestro trabajo también es mantener las unidades que están abiertas al público, a las que la gente puede pasar, mantenerlas en condiciones seguras y para que no sacarlas de exhibición, sino mantener lo que ya está conservado, hacemos un esfuerzo muy grande para que eso ya se mantenga, no dejarlo que empiece a tener problemas serios de restauración. Esta es una de nuestras locomotoras más valiosas. Aquí, por ejemplo, tenemos lo que parece ser un problema de conservación, pero no lo es. Es como la gente se puede sentar, hay acceso al interior, se van a degradar los asientos. Pero es un vinil nuevo, entonces nosotros se cambia, no es un problema real de restauración y sin embargo permite al visitante subir, sacarse una fotografía en la máquina, tener una visita más interactiva a las piezas del museo. Esta es otra de las máquinas a las que la gente puede subir adentro, tocar, hacer todo. Esta es la misma durante una filmación. Este también es otro de los coches, los que estuvieron en la visita seguramente lo recuerdan. Y aquí el caso es un caso muy similar. La madera sí es original, así como las lámparas y las rejillas, pero las vestiduras de este coche no, esas son nuevas. Y esas sí tenemos la tela para poder cambiarlo. Entonces eso nos permite, en este caso, sí tenerlo abierto al público sin que exista un problema grave, si se dañan. Sí. Todas estas unidades son a las que la gente puede o entrar a su interior o pasar a la cabina en el caso de las locomotoras. Este es de la película Gringo Viejo. También las unidades de vía angosta. Estos coches son los que actualmente sí presentan un problema más grave de conservación, precisamente por el material constitutivo que es madera y las condiciones en las que se encuentra. Es este coche preparado para una filmación. Quería mostrar esto porque es muy interesante cómo se adapta. El cabús, que también es una de las piezas favoritas, también requiere un mantenimiento permanente. Es para que se pueda conservar abierto al público. Es muy importante para nosotros poder ofrecer eso a la gente, porque además la gente lo solicita mucho. Bueno, estas ya son unidades que no están abiertas normalmente al público, pero sí están restauradas y se mantienen en buenas condiciones para permitir visitas guiadas, eventos especiales y cosas así. Este es el autovía en este caso. Y es lo mismo, cuando empezamos a detectar deterioros en estos coches, los corregimos de manera rápida antes de que se deteriore más para mantenerlos, ¿no? Para no dejar que se pongan más graves los problemas de conservación. Ahora, también la simple limpieza del equipo, por sus dimensiones, ya implica un trabajo muy interesante. ¿Cómo se pone? Si piensan en cuánto tiempo se tarda en lavar un coche, ¿no? Y comparan con el tamaño de una locomotora, o sea, y pensando en la cantidad de equipo que tenemos, es algo que sí es un esfuerzo muy importante. Y también el mantenimiento mecánico. Esta locomotora sí está en condiciones operativas. Ahí se encuentra durante unas maniobras. Este es otro de los... Sí, bueno, ocasionalmente, sí. Esa locomotora es la que usamos para movimientos en el concierto Sinfonía a Vapor. Es la fuente de poder. El coche Escuela Frenos de Aire, que es un coche muy interesante, que también está restaurado y listo para cualquier visita. Este es uno de los coches que más gustan a la gente, el Club Chepe. El Sonora, aquí en este caso tenemos un coche que ya estaba restaurado, ya estaba abierto al público y empezó a sufrir un problema de conservación muy grave simplemente por estar a la intemperie. Toda la pintura del techo se empezó a desprender por los cambios de temperatura del sol. Pero lo que hicimos es que lo programamos para volver a reintegrarlo a las unidades restauradas, no dejarlo que se deteriorara más. Las piezas que ahí se ven tenían 7 o 8 capas de pintura y abajo es bronce con recubrimiento de oro, algunas son doradas, ya se hizo el estudio. Y todos las decoraciones, accesorios, ganchos, lámparas, todo estaba cubierto de pintura que se quitó. Sí. Y bueno, actualmente estamos haciendo la restauración de la locomotora 2203. Se está haciendo la restauración exterior y la pintura, pero también estamos recuperando su estado operacional. Ya se hizo el cambio de aceite, que suena fácil, pero son 1200 litros de aceite. Y lo que estamos haciendo es que necesitamos unas baterías nuevas y ya deberíamos muy pronto ya tener esta locomotora en condiciones funcionales. El otro coche que estamos restaurando actualmente es el Janitzio. Este es un coche comedor que tiene unos murales, en esta foto no se distingue, pero en la siguiente, muy interesantes. Sin embargo, tiene unos faltantes muy grandes. No sé si pasaron al laboratorio el lunes, verán que estamos haciendo los trazos de los faltantes, porque de este coche parece ser que hay 4 que se pintaron de la misma manera, el mismo artista los pintó. Sí, Edgar Miller, y ya localizamos unas imágenes muy buenas de los otros coches, entonces ya tenemos una fuente para poder hacer la restauración. Esto, por ejemplo, es una de las imágenes que nos puede funcionar. Y, por ejemplo, el mobiliario, ya detectamos que efectivamente están los huecos de donde estaban las cosas. Entonces, esto nos va a permitir hacer una restauración muy buena. Bueno, eso es la 2203 de nuevo. Parte de los trabajos previos para hacer eso, tomamos muestras de pintura cuando es necesario. Aquí teníamos la duda sobre la franja blanca superior, si existía o no. En esta foto histórica sí la tiene, pero no la tenía actualmente. Sacamos unas muestras de pintura y esa es la toma en el microscopio de la muestra y ahí se ve que sí estaba también. Entonces ya sabemos que efectivamente la debe de llevar. Bueno, la conservación del equipo rodante tiene, bueno, entre otros 2 problemas importantes que es lo que estamos buscando la manera de resolver. Uno es cómo poder dar más acceso al público. Y el otro, que es cómo mantenerlos en condiciones de intemperismo. La parte de las condiciones de intemperismo y también de la primera parte es algo de lo que vamos a tratar de ver el viernes en el taller. Esto no es un problema nuevo en los museos ferrocarrileros, hay muchos casos muy similares, tanto aquí, y también es algo que han estado, con lo que han estado lidiando en los museos de Estados Unidos por muchos años, por lo que me han comentado los ponentes americanos. Entonces esperamos que sea muy buena esa sesión. Porque algo de lo que estamos viendo es que aunque se puede dar el mantenimiento, podemos tratar de pintar, reparar ventanas, eventualmente, a largo plazo, no es realmente una solución sostenible. Entonces, eso es lo que estamos pensando, ¿qué vamos a hacer a largo plazo? Ese es uno de los enfoques. Bueno, aquí, como parte, digamos, de los criterios de intervención, enfoques, el primero es que cada caso es distinto. Por ejemplo, aquí se está aplicando una capa gruesa de resina epóxica en este caso, a una pieza que ya sabemos que va a estar en exteriores porque está destinada a estar en una exposición en exteriores en la lluvia, y entonces es una intervención muy agresiva que nunca soñaríamos con aplicar algo así a una pieza de bronce o una herramienta o algo por la cuestión estética. Pero en este caso, por las condiciones en la que estará la pieza, por eso se hace de esta manera. Bueno, aquí esta es una lista de los criterios de mínima intervención. Ese probablemente es, bueno, ese es uno de los más importantes. Déjame ver un momentito. Conservación de la historicidad y de la segunda historicidad. Tenemos casos, sobre todo en el equipo rodante, donde es muy difícil decir cuál era el estado original de la unidad. Sufrió transformaciones, reparaciones, y lo que hacemos es que conservamos todo eso ya es parte de su historia también. El análisis detallado de la pieza y su lugar en el conjunto, es muy importante no romper grupos de piezas y conjuntos. La restauración solo en casos excepcionales. Un caso excepcional es el equipo que está a la intemperie, ¿no? Preservación de pátinas, como ya habíamos visto. Documentación detallada de todos los procesos, esa es una parte también muy importante. El seguimiento, tenemos ya muchos años aquí, entonces ya podemos ver cómo han reaccionado los tratamientos. Eso nos ha ayudado mucho para ver qué cosas funcionan, qué cosas no funcionan. Y hay veces donde pues hay que actuar de emergencia cuando hay un deterioro activo, eso hay que tomarlo en cuenta. A ver, la siguiente. No sé si se distingue en la imagen, pero esta pieza tiene marcas de taller. Hemos encontrado en muchas piezas que tienen así, marquitas, o sea, o de la gente que lo reparó o de fábrica, o de su fabricación. Y esos elementos los documentamos y los conservamos. Bueno, obviamente todo esto no sucede solo, sino que somos un equipo muy dedicado, que lo hacen realmente por amor al ferrocarril, entonces aquí quería poner el nombre de todos. Y, ¿qué más? Y no sé si da tiempo para pasar nada más rápidamente unas imágenes de San Blas. No, creo que está en la misma. Y estas las voy a pasar. No sé si alguien reconoce qué es eso. Pues este es un caso en el que, debido a una sequía prolongada en San Blas Fuerte, Sinaloa, bajó el nivel del río y detectaron que había una locomotora. Y bueno, nos hablaron porque no sabían, no creo que se distingue mucho. Bueno, las líneas en morado es donde está el nivel actual del río, ahí se ve. Esta. Y efectivamente es una locomotora de vapor del ferrocarril. Parece ser que es del ferrocarril Kansas City, México y Oriente, si no me equivoco. Y, a ver. Ahora, por la medida del cilindro, no hay tantas locomotoras con un cilindro de ese diámetro, de 18 pulgadas, si no me equivoco. Entonces ya casi estamos seguros de cuál locomotora es. Este es un caso muy interesante. Ahora, estas fotos se tomaron en junio. Actualmente no se puede ver. Ya empezaron las lluvias y está otra vez abajo del nivel. Que es una ventaja porque las ruedas que se ven ahí ya les habían estado golpeando con un cincel para quitarle pedacitos para vender en la chatarra. Entonces la gente de la población ya rescató las ruedas y las tiene resguardadas. Y lo demás ya se cubrió por el agua. Ahora, ahí el caso es, ¿qué se haría en ese caso? Entonces es algo que es un proyecto muy reciente y estamos analizando qué posibilidades hay. La que se hace más, bueno, la que estamos pensando, por lo menos para iniciar, es documentar perfectamente bien lo que se pueda y dejar que suba el río para protegerlo. Y después ya se verá si se trata de hacer otra cosa. Bueno, ese es el roster. Ay, perdón, ya me pasé. Pues sería básicamente eso. Bueno, muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Terry, por este trabajo y Bruno por este trabajo maravilloso de restauración. Tenemos media hora, bueno, no media hora, tenemos tiempo para hacer preguntas. Quien tenga algún interés por el trabajo de los compañeros, pueden preguntar o callar para siempre.